Welcome to the Regulation Podcast, brought to you by the Institute of Regulation. Once again, we hope this podcast will help you understand what regulation is all about, what it's all for, and of course why it matters to the public. My name is Anthony Oliver, and I'm going to lead today's discussion as we explore the findings of a recent report by the Regulatory Reform Group on the purpose of regulation. So some background. The Regulatory Reform Group is a group of Conservative MPs who've come together specifically, as they put it, to help shape a regulatory system which, following Brexit, they say, needs to have a democratic accountability at its heart. The report asserts that a lack of focus on outcomes mean there is, in reality, little to no democratic oversight of the systems controlling vast amounts of public expenditure each year. And in a post-Brexit Britain, it adds, consumer outcomes must be at the centre of a new systematic approach to all regulatory activity if the UK economy is to benefit from its new life outside the EU. So much to discuss as usual. I hope we can give you a new perspective on the priorities and challenges you face as regulators and a clear understanding of how the Institute of Regulation can help. So let me introduce my guest today, Bim Afolami, MP and Chair of the Regulatory Reform Group, one of the key drivers behind the first report on the purpose of regulation. Bim, welcome to the Regulation Podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Great. So in your introduction to the report, Bim, you state that following Brexit, creating a new systematic approach to regulation is one of the major issues that needs to be addressed to help drive long-term economic growth. So what do you mean by a systematic approach?
I mean a different approach from the one that we've had for the best part of 30 years as the regulatory state has developed and grown up. And that different approach is one that accepts that we now, because of the increased complexity of the economy, because of changes in Europe, because of broader societal trends, Parliament has chosen, and the government, successive governments have chosen, to hive off certain functions away from Parliament and away from government departments to regulators as people who are meant to come in with specialist understanding and expertise in different areas. Now, that's fine, but we need to update our parliamentary system and the way we do things in order to match that. What the core of looking at this systematically is to understand what we are trying to do with regulation and to put that in place, starting almost from first principles, from the centre of government and indeed in Parliament.
I mean, clearly Brexit's brought about a number of changes across the UK. I mean, you talk about the UK's 40-year membership of the EU having hollowed out appropriate democratic oversight of regulators, in effect outsourcing this oversight to Brussels. I mean, how can the group help to correct this democratic deficit and regain the ability to scrutinise whether the regulators have the right objectives or not?
In essence, pre-Brexit, you have a highly developed, complex system of oversight of regulators that are done at the European Union level in areas such as financial services, though there are others, telecommunications, financial services, pharmaceutical. What we need to do is, within the history and the culture and the traditions of the British parliamentary system, have some form of that at British level. At the moment, we do not have that. And that's what we're seeking to create.
And behind that, and I suppose the ultimate ambition, you describe it as establishing a world-leading regulatory regime in the long term. So what is world-leading regulatory regime? How do you define it in this post-Brexit world?
I mean, I accept that when you say things like world-leading or world-beating, it makes me sound like a pound shot Boris. And I've been accused of many things, but a pound shot Boris is not one of them. So what I mean by that is that, if you look at economic performance, not just in Britain, but across most Western countries, broadly speaking, economic performance has been poorer over the last 15 years than it was over the previous 15 years. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. I don't pretend there's one cause of that, but one of them is that Western societies have chosen to impose a lot more regulation in their economies, to stop people doing things. That is usually the purpose of a regulation. It is to stop somebody doing things in a way that they were previously doing it. Now, often that is for very, very good reason. You've got all sorts of health and safety regulations on how you sell products, regulation on speed with which you can drive your car, etc. But if you can make this regulation as effective as possible. So achieving the aim that you want at the same time as making sure you get the economic growth, that is what can really help your economy. On the flip side, if you have lots of confusing regulation that nobody in the private sector can interpret, that is poorly implemented, and then the people who are doing that poor implementation are not checked or overseen by anybody, you end up with a situation where economically you really lose out. Now, I know economics isn't everything, and there are regulators who are not to do with economic sort of function at all. But if we focus on the economics, world leading is where we have people visiting from all over the world to see how have they managed to improve things in Britain on their economy. Why is it that our multinationals are saying, why don't you have a regulatory system like Britain? And when we're having those people visit and try and copy how we do things because of the superior economic performance in lots of sectors, that's what world leading or indeed world beating would look like.
But I suppose you also, in the report, you recognised, in defence of the regulation system we have now, that there are some success stories. We are recognised as a world leader already, even though there's change needed. I mean, what would you say are the success stories?
So there are bespoke areas where we regulate well. I think broadly speaking, financial services is regulated well, for example. And actually, I'd say the flexibility shown in COVID by the MHRA on regulating new drugs and vaccines, I think is a very good example. Look at the comparison between British regulators and regulators in certain other parts of the world looking at exactly the same vaccine. Right. And you see the huge variation with speed and adaptability. So I think that those are two areas where we regulate well. But actually what we're talking about is to move away from this approach of saying, well, this bit is done well. We need a comprehensive view across government, across parliament of regulating better, because in a lot of areas, things overlap. Okay. Once you have silos, which are inevitable in any system, at the moment, our system cannot really adapt or account for where an environmental regulation impacts on housing, which impacts on economic growth. We just don't have the ability to do that. And that is the sort of 360 view that we need to have a better regulatory system. Because often, by the way, the businesses that are affected by this, or indeed the individuals that are affected by this, or the community groups that are affected by this, find themselves speaking to lots of different regulators to do different things with wildly different time spans, wildly different accountability regimes, wildly different approaches, wildly different results. And that isn't good for our economy, or indeed for our society more broadly.
No. Well, I suppose silos are a function of many parts of government, not just in regulation. So I suppose tackling silos is a really strong thing to do. Let's just have a quick romp through the report. You highlight 4 specific areas where you say the regulatory system is underperforming. Can we just have a look at each? So just explain what you mean and how you see the required change. I mean, the first is you described strained regulatory relationships. What's caused it to happen?
Broadly, there are 2 things that cause strained regulatory relationships. The first is if the political end of government, the political part of government, the government department, is not clear enough about the remit of the regulator, and then blames the regulator for poor performance, with the regulator then saying it's because you weren't clear. And often the reason is sort of, they're often it's a 50-50 fault. But my broad point, that often causes strained regulatory relationships. The other thing that causes strained regulatory relationships is, frankly, when regulators seek to willfully ignore what is the clear government aim strategically and hide behind minutiae in order to get what they want as a vested interest, rather than do what is the broad government outlook. And they say, well, we're independent, so, boo-hoo. Right. That causes very poor regulatory relationships as well.
Okay. Second one you say is incomplete lines of accountability. I mean, accountability comes up in many areas of government, but what do you mean? And how do you define this in terms of regulation, and what do you see as a solution?
The accountability is difficult because what you end up with is regulators are all sponsored by a department. Right? Every regulator is technically sitting under a department. But problems, as I was saying earlier, are often multifaceted or involve many departments. And so if there is, for example, a problem to do with, and I take an issue with nutrient neutrality that we've had that's blown up recently, this issue's been knocking around for a year. I was talking about it in my report. And when I talked about it in my report, it wasn't new. And several months, 3-4 months later, we're finally dealing with this problem. Why is this the case? Because the environmental Natural England, which sits under DEFRA, refused to change its guidance that it had given to local authorities, because as far as they're concerned, they don't report in to local authority housing department. That's not their problem. Their problem is looking at DEFRA. And I understand how they've got to that point, because they would say, well, if you're in Natural England, you start responding to housing, well, you'll end up with a very different sort of regime. So I understand their predicament. This is a perfect example of an incomplete line of accountability.
So again, it goes back to this silos issue, breaking down those silos. Thirdly, you highlight a lack of strategic direction. Who has to change this, and how are they going to do that?
I think this is both in government and in parliament. We just have to care about regulation a lot more. And I don't say that as an academic. I don't say that out of principle. I say that because unless you care about regulation more, in a modern economy, you aren't going to get the policy outcomes that you want. So the question is, do you want to govern or don't you? Do you want to actually make decisions, or do you want to pretend to make decisions? Pretending to make decisions is really easy. There are lots of actors who've managed it in various films. If you actually want to make decisions and have those decisions have an effect on the country, you are going to have to work out how to use regulation or not to use regulation, or how to get rid of the regulator, or how to change the rules, or whatever it is. But you need to engage properly with regulators. And I think that Parliament and government has been guilty in recent years of not really bothering.
Okay. Finally, the report highlights the need to build skills and knowledge, which of course is something which the Institute of Regulation talks an awful lot about as well. Talk us through, what you see as having to happen right now to build those skills and knowledge.
Two areas where you need to build skills and knowledge are in government and in Parliament. In Parliament, by having a specialist regulatory committee, oversight committee, or whatever you call it, that looks at the performance of regulators, looks strategically at different issues, not just reactive to whatever's in the newspapers every day. That will educate a group of parliamentarians, won't be everybody, to really understand the regulatory state a lot better. And in government, if in the Cabinet Office or somewhere else, very central, we could have a group of specialists buttressed and supported by secondees from industry and private sector, who really started to build up that understanding and development of how regulators and how the regulatory system works. That would help the civil service and indeed ministers to better understand regulation.
Okay. The report also has a number of recommendations, the first of which is to establish a clear definition of a regulator to enable better scrutiny. Why has that been so difficult in the past then? Just actually defining what a regulator is all about.
It was nobody's job. You just had random departments randomly deciding to establish regulators on a random basis. So nobody has a list. And when the Public Accounts Committee, or rather when the National Audit Office went to try and find a list, none existed. So, that's a starting point. Right. You could, by the way, argue that you don't need a list, because at the moment, don't forget, it's up to departments to sponsor the regulators. So frankly, as long as the department knows what it's sponsoring, you could argue you don't need a centralized list. And that's fair enough. But the difficulty is you often have bodies that are not technically regulators. They are advisory bodies, but in effect give regulation. Natural England, I give us a perfect example, gives guidance to local authorities that in effect acts as a regulation.
Right. But I suppose we've discussed this on other podcasts with the regulation about the regulation industry. This balance between giving regulators the teeth to actually enforce change and actually the power to persuade. And I suppose if you'd actually define that properly, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah. No, I agree.
There's other recommendations based around the structure and oversight. You talk about a joint committee for oversight of regulators, an office for oversight of regulators in the Cabinet Office, a new accountability framework, and an open two-way dialogue. How do you see the new Institute of Regulation helping to shape this new world of regulation?
Well, really by supporting proposals to change. I think that there's a danger that incumbents in any system, politicians are no different, people in the private sector are no different, basically saying, well, hold on, I don't really want any change, because this change will mean that politicians have more control. And if politicians have more control, that means I have less control. So I would urge the Institute to think about it not to be captured by the people it works with the most, which are people in regulatory bodies, and to recognize that if regulatory bodies want to not just be, because the danger for the regulatory bodies is if we don't fix this problem, as time goes on, you will just have periodic shootings of regulators who are blamed when something goes wrong. And that shooting will be done pour encourager les autres. Okay. And I just don't think that is what the exposed position that regulators want to be in. What they want is to have clear guidance and understanding about what decisions they're taking, what decisions they're not taking. And as part of the price of that, accept that they have been, in some instances, sort of making decisions on the fly for their own purposes. Not that they thought they were bad decisions, they probably thought they were very good decisions, but doing it without the political world being fully aware of it and accepting that that's going to require a bit more of them saying, no, we're not taking that decision. That is for politicians. You guys make the decision and we will implement.
Which goes straight back to the first recommendation, which is the definition of what you're actually trying to do. One of the things you highlight is about fragmentation. I know the Institute regulation is really keen to use its forum to bring lots of different regulators together. I mean, do you see that as the big opportunity?
I think I deliberately haven't gone on about this too much because I just think once you get into a world of saying, oh, this regulator's useless or isn't needed, or these three can be merged, it sort of diverts from the actual purpose of what you're trying to talk about. And I'd be wrong because I don't know enough about enough regulators. So if I was to turn around and say, right, I don't know, we're going to merge the financial services regulators or merge the ones involved with pensions, I know a bit about those, then it would almost be as if all the others were fine. And that's not necessarily the case. But at the same time, just because you were to merge a regulator doesn't actually mean that they would work any better as one organization. You and I both know that what would end up happening is if you were to merge regulators, often they'll keep the same buildings that they were in before. And so you wouldn't really get the thing that you thought you were getting, and you've created a lot of cost and administrative hassle and lots of people worried about their jobs for something that didn't really change anything. But
there is opportunity for them to learn from each other, I imagine, because they all kind of they're facing similar problems, similar challenges.
That's true.
Let's talk a bit about you, Bim. I mean, you're a Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. You've been, having been elected in 2017. But before you entered Parliament, you worked in corporate law and then in banking. I mean, how did you end up so interested in regulation?
I'm interested in regulation because of its impact on the economy and its impact about how our system of government and parliamentary democracy works. That's why I'm interested in it. Right. So I start from a position of wanting our constitutional framework to work properly and for the economy to be more productive. And it's led me to regulation that way round. And I think because of, I was a corporate lawyer at Freshfields, then Simpson, Thacher and Bartlett, and then being in banking, I've got enough of a comfort with looking at stuff like that means that I don't find it too boring or unduly challenging. If there was a colleague, for example, who's got an experience, I don't know, in running car factories, their experience is great in some circumstances, but they probably don't particularly find it as easy to go through pages of regulation. Do you see what I mean? So we all have different skills. And for me, this is something that, and the people in the regulatory reform group, people like Vicky Ford, who's at JP Morgan and the European Parliament Financial Services Committee, people like Robert Buckland, former Lord Chancellor, so we've got Andrew Tyree, who is chair of the Treasury Select Committee and chair of the CMA as well. So these are people, most of whom have really got an understanding of regulation and government. People like James Wild, who people won't necessarily have heard of, but he's a new MP from 2019, so a couple of years sort of after I joined. And James worked in the Cabinet Office for a long time, so really saw from the Cabinet Office how sort of thing works. So I've sort of sought to bring together the people that had an interest and understanding of how these things worked.
Okay, but you're also vice chairman of the Conservative Party for Youth.
I was.
You were.
Not continuing. Yeah.
Okay, but you are still all-party chair of the all-party parliamentary group for renewables and sustainable energy. Yeah, I mean, I mention this because they're very future-focused activities. I mean, how do you help in your role in those, to help new sustainable ideas to gain more traction, in very established organisations and establishments?
I don't know. You tell me. How do you think I'm doing? I mean, it's easy because politics, there's always 1,000 things going on. But I just think if you're in politics, you've got to do these things. People elect you, yes, to be a constituency MP, but also this isn't the council. This is the parliament of the country. So you've got to think of national issues and you've got to try and improve them.
Okay. I have to mention the fact that I saw that you played football at university. You were Berkshire County champion for both 400 metres and triple jump as a schoolboy, competed at a national level. Are you still an athlete?
No, in short.
Not at all.
No, I did play. I'm still a good footballer, but you know, in your head, you're young. And I realized, you know, I'm 37 and I've realized that I'm the age where when I was a kid, I used to say, oh my goodness, they should retire. They're too old. You know, they can't play, they can't run anymore. It's embarrassing if they're playing. And you just recognize now that, you know, my definition of old is somebody who's older than you. And my definition of young is somebody who's younger than you. And it adapts every year.
Yeah. Well, you're also the father to 3 boys. I mean, how do you balance your time between work and your family commitments?
I mean, what politicians normally say on this sort of thing is they say, well, you know, I'm just so dedicated to my family and then I spend all my time working. I don't know how those two things work. I mean, what I say is that if you have a vocation, and politics and public services is a vocation, it is. Your life is being involved in politics. That is your life. So effectively, as part of your life, you look after your children and you're married and you do various things and you go down the pub and you see your friends and you go for weekends away and you go on holiday. And this is all just part of your life. And so I don't really think of my life in this is work time, this is not work time, because frankly, politics is all the time. And the way of doing that in a way that doesn't drive you mad is to recognize that often the best politics is when you're not doing formal politics. When I live in my constituency, when I'm in my constituency, if I go to the fete, I don't turn up on my own normally, very rarely. If I'm going to a fete, I'll be taking my children there. You know, I'll be going with my children. I'm seeing them at the fete. Frankly, if I'm doing something with my kids, then I won't go to the fete. And I just accept that. I'm not, do you see, you've just got to live your life as a public person, as a member of parliament. And I think that's probably the healthiest and easiest way to do it without stressing yourself out.
So six years into your new career, you don't miss the old life of the old quiet life of banking and corporate law?
No, I mean, weirdly, not at all. I thought I would. I really, really don't. And the reason why I don't is because I think that what you're doing in politics is so exciting all the time. Even if you're not doing the exciting things are happening. So every single day is interesting. And I think your typical city job, even at, you know, top firms where I was, you know, there's just a lot of the days aren't very interesting and you accept that. I think the thing I do miss though, is I think that the real focus on getting things absolutely right and there being highest quality possible in substantive terms in the world of the city is something that when you're not in the city anymore, you realize you can't take for granted. I think that in politics and government, there is to some degree an acceptance of mediocrity in different ways, in different circumstances, at different levels. And that can be frustrating, I think, if you're used to a focus on trying to be as good as humanly possible in everything that happens.
Okay. But of course, in the role you do now, it is all about serving the public, and I suppose good regulation is vital to the effective function of business and of actually delivering public services. It's a force for preventing bad outcomes, but it's also a force to drive improvement. Is it possible, for regulation to better serve the public?
Of course, and I think consumer regulation is a very good example. The area where I think it's difficult is where there is a contrast in the short term between, for example, in utilities, keeping bills low and investing in the infrastructure that takes 20 years.
Right.
You might think the best thing to do to the public is to keep bills low. And that may be correct. But at some point, you're going to have to increase the investment in the infrastructure, the sewage systems, the water systems, the pipes.
Yeah.
And that cost is going to be borne by that same public.
Okay.
And so getting that balance is actually the really tricky thing.
Yeah. Because regulators, they do need to balance this, the need to enforce poor behaviour with the need to encourage better behaviour. I mean, one of the ways to do that, financial penalties, is one way of doing it. Is that ever appropriate, given that it just reduces available cash available to help the public?
Oh, I mean, they do already.
Yeah.
The American regulators do this on steroids. I mean, they really, really do huge financial penalties that then go back into the system. And I think that's not a bad way of doing things. I always take the view that as long as somebody isn't trying to be fraudulent or malfeasant, then actually a big financial penalty is a lot better than going down what you describe as like a more typical legal court sort of outcome, because it puts people off from doing it. If you put big financial penalties on private sector organizations, trust me, that's enough. They will change, and that way you actually raise a lot of money for the system to then be as effective as possible.
So talk about your ambitions, just to finish off, your ambitions for the regulatory reform group, and can it really bring about the required reform across regulation? What is the process for doing that?
So, I mean, I was in Downing Street earlier this week. I was speaking to the Business Secretary of State, Business and Trade Secretary of State this morning about regulation. Darren Jones, who's just gone into the Shadow Cabinet, who's chair of the Business Select Committee, him and I talked about this a lot, and there was definitely purchase, people like Seema Malhotra, Darren Jones, and others on the Labour side. So there is a parliamentary aspect to this, both within my own side and cross-party. There is a within government aspect to this, because the Prime Minister, his team, and the Business Secretary, and really later this year, making a real push on regulation politically to drive that through to the election and make it. And so my job is and helping them think this through, is to how can make this politically salient enough that we can really get things moving. Because there's no point doing it as an academic exercise. That isn't how politics works. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, to make sure that, give them confidence that I've really thought it through, so that we can drive it through Whitehall. Because if they don't think I've fully thought it through, then Whitehall won't take it seriously. It won't go anywhere.
And having established the purpose of regulation, what's the second report going to be looking at?
Well, this is currently a lot of debate amongst the group. I suspect what we're going to do is we're going to really focus on governance and a couple of key areas where we're actually going to highlight the detail of what we mean. So almost to say, look, we've given you the principles. We're going to take these areas, and this is what would happen in these areas if we follow through our principles, and to actually get into the detail of it, to show people how this looks in practice.
Okay. Finally, what advice would you give those working in regulation today to help them really deliver the better outcomes that for communities that you seek?
Get the chairs and the CEOs of your organizations to get in touch with the department and make clear what it is that they are meant to be doing under the remit, and make clear that the department is happy with that remit. And get all that and really force the department to think about what they are doing. And yes, you make sure the remit they are happy with, because I think that way you're much clearer that you can take real decisions without blowback.
Okay. Which is about defining the purpose of that regulation, I suppose. So, Bim, thanks so much for joining me today on the Regulation Podcast. The report certainly has got some really interesting and challenging views for the regulatory profession to digest. So thanks for explaining some of those ideas today.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'm sure you're going to hear a bit more from Bim and the RRG's Work in the Future podcast very soon. But in the meantime, if you haven't done so already, do check out the Institute of Regulation website. That's www.ioregulation.org, where you'll find a huge amount of really useful information about the Institute, how you can get involved, and of course, the issues and challenges facing regulation. And of course, you'll find details of all the latest podcasts, which you can listen to and share. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to Bim. And on behalf of the Institute of Regulation, I look forward to seeing you again very soon.